Thank you very much. Hope everybody's seeing my screen now. All right, so first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Queer Code for giving the opportunity for me to come and talk about something that I really love, it's games and game history. We're going to a little journey from the very beginning of the gaming to the days of today. But before, I'd like to give you a bit of background about myself. My name is Dan Bernardo, and my first degree is as an anthropologist. I also a creative director, a game director. And 2 years ago, I founded Playtra Games, which is a small studio here in London. I am the studio myself by myself today, where we create games that have different thematics. Right now, we are working on action strategy game called Grid Fight. And the thing about the game is that it's inhabited in a universe that they're just female characters. The reason for that is that the team came together to say like what kind of heroes and heroines we want to talk about. And we all agree that all of us have some people in our lives that we call heroes and heroines, and they're all female, moms and sisters and teachers, and we want to do something, a kind of homage for those stories. So we put together a team to talk about it, a female writer, so you want to make sure to have the right point of view. If you are a gamer, you can have a look at this on Steam, have a demo. If you're not a gamer, just look it up, and if you like it, just try it. Okay, so before starting the talk itself, I would like to go a little game with you guys. So whoever is a gamer will probably get this much faster. But I'm going to show you two characters. So on the left and on the right. The question is for you right now is who of these two characters, that are video game characters, you think is the villain, and who you think is the hero. So I'll give you just a couple of seconds and see if you manage to guess. Let's try another one. Who is the villain? Who is the hero? Last one now. Hero and villain. By the way, the nice lady on the left is called Poison, and she is one of the first transgender characters in video games. Of course, in this era, in the beginning of the gaming era, if you are anything that is not straight and white, mostly, you are a villain, like by default. But why is this important? Why is the question about who is the villain important? Well, this is the way we connect to stories, and every medium has a different way of connecting. But for games especially, this is a very relevant question. Games, in the media of video games, the two most important things are identification and personification. So most games ask you first to identify who is the good person and who is the bad person, and then personify this person while you are playing the game. So suddenly this question about who is the villain becomes crucial, because it's the one that determines which of the characters the player is allowed to identify herself or himself with. So to understand the uneasy story of identification and representation, we're going to go through the decades of the game development right now. It started in the very beginning, the 70s, quite basic games, to the days of today. I'm going to be using one or two examples of each one of the different decades, so it don't become like an hour-long talk. But I'd like just to use this to illustrate how games evolve with our society as well. starting with the 70s. The 70s were very interesting era because there was nothing before there. The first games started appearing. And to be honest, there was not much of a queer representation that time because there was no character representation that time. So every time you have a new medium, think about the TV, start in the first days, trying to emulate radio. So every time you have a new medium that's trying to emulate something that came before. So the first games in that era were all trying to simulate real life games like checkers or tennis. So you don't have really characters there. The one thing I want to talk about this era is just to see the scale of how things moved with a borderline of money. That is, in the end, what makes these industries run. In the beginning of the gaming era, you have probably, in terms of revenue, around $2 or $3 million a year. To have an idea for today, before the whole pandemic, music was expected to have like 19 billion of revenue in a year. Movies around 41.9 billion. And games, this is before the lockdowns, was supposed to be $153 billion. So it's like more than the other two combined by far. So it showed that the very beginning, in the 70s, this was like a hobby of things for teenagers and kids, and now it's probably the biggest industry in the world. So now that you know a bit about that, let's just keep going, starting in the 80s. 80s was more or less like the 70s. It was like most games are mostly simulations of games in real life. But then this new genre of games started happening, that is the adventure, especially the clicker adventure. So you see lots of stories with new characters, but not much of gay representation, queer in general representation. Apart from one little game, there's a typo there, I hate that. So there is one game called Copper in the Castro. And this game is important. First of all, it was what we call charityware. So this was not a commercial game. There was no launch for you to buy. Instead, if you want, you can just make a copy. And the developer, in this case was CM Raffle, asked, okay, you make a copy of the game and then you just donate to a charity you like. In this case, he asked the donation to be sent to some AIDS-related cause. This is a very tongue-in-cheek game. It's probably the first game that is not commercial, but it has queer main character. It was this lesbian lady called Tracker My Dick, very subtle. And the whole story was with references about the queer scene of California of the days. Although Copper was very, very important, it was not a commercial game. So the distribution and the appeal of the public was actually quite limited. The first time that you see something with a queer character, it actually comes from Nintendo. You might, if you're not a gamer, even if you're not a gamer, you might know Nintendo. So you have the Wii and you have Game Boy, and it's just a staple of our pop culture right now. Maybe you might not know that Nintendo has a kind of reputation of being quite conservative in terms of depiction of minorities or women or anything else that's non-normative. Which is a big, like, it's hard to understand because there's a huge queer audience that is they're huge fans of Nintendo. So even for today, to this day, Nintendo struggles to like conciliate these two things. That is very conservative in their games, but at the same time, there's this huge queer audience that love their games. But Beardo is, as all game or characters of this era and many eras, made as a joke. So if you go and see Beardo and you go see the game manual and read about Beardo, what you're gonna read is, Beardo is a male who likes dressing up and going by the name of Birdetta. And that's all. This is all you have as representation in the 80s from Nintendo. Why I think this is important? This is important because it shows curiosity. It shows interest in something outside the normative. the developers was trying to add things that they not have left before in the games. And although after this in Japan, many other games start putting characters quote unquote queer, you'll not have something as important as what happened in Final Fantasy VI. So again, Final Fantasy is very well known by gamers around the world. The story of this franchise it deserves its own documentary one day. But Final Fantasy is probably like the blockbuster of RPGs in Japan. So RPGs are the role-playing games. So the games, they have a deeper story in them. So you have more space for characters to develop. And in Final Fantasy VII, you have this character that's not explicitly queer. He acts in a very queer manner. Is Kefta. And of course, he is the villain. He is the bad guy. Why it's important is because the first time you see the developers and storytellers trying to understand a queer character. So he was evil. He was the most mad person in this universe, but he'd been through stuff. So he has a lot of tragedy coming in his background. And so I almost can see the developer saying, oh, you see, he's evil and he is queer, but he's been through stuff. There's the reason why he's queer. Of course, this is not what you want as a representation, but it shows curiosity. And something that will continue going on throughout this decade in game development in Japan mostly. Of course, not all developers have the same curiosity. They are trying to add queer characters, but in favor of their own audiences. And it's the same time the trove of the hypersexualized queer character appears. So this character is Morrigan, and she is bisexual character in a fighting game. She's quite comfortable with her sexuality. She can date guys, girls, and everything in between. And the only reason why this character is there is as a fan service to the teenager straight boys who have the fantasy of having this lady who is quite open to everything, and she's quite voluptuous, let's say. Unfortunately, this trope of reducing a character to female, bisexual, sexy toy exists for many, many years, even to the days of today. But why was this acceptable? This was acceptable actually in the US and Western countries. The reason why, you probably saw something quite if you're a gamer, you probably noticed something weird for the games that I showed so far. Apart from Castle, all games that I showed to you guys so far has been made in Japan. And there's a reason for that. There is a big cultural difference between Japanese audiences and American audiences, especially how Japanese audiences are much more comfortable in having sex-related themes and violence in the media they consume. And American audiences are much more conservative about those things. So all these games and all the experimentation and try to understand these queer characters actually happen in Japan. But if these characters in these games want to come to America, they have to change, they have to adapt. They cannot be talking about queer people because this is unacceptable. And this happened for a long time. So you remember this character that I showed before, Poison, one of the first transgender characters in video games. Well, when this game was launched in the US, they changed and she became Sid, ordinary dude. The reason to that is so there was more palatable to the audiences of America. And this would happen for the rest of the decade. All games in Japan will start like trying to experiment and understand the queer space, but games in America, in Europe by extent, would be much more tamed, let's say. There was one big change in the West though, and it came with this game called Fallout 2. For me, also, you have to understand the representation of queer characters just start becoming serious and a bit more realistic from the 2000s onward. From this point to this point, everything that is queer in games is mostly a reason for a joke. So in Fallout, you have this, again, RPG, and you have the chance to marry somebody from the same sex of your character. And there's just 2 characters you can marry, and they are completely useless. The only reason for you to marry them is to say, oh, how weird this is, how absurd it is for you to get married to somebody with the same sex. And I have mixed feelings about this screenshot. This screenshot is about the same-sex marriage scene in the game. And then the father says, I knew my daughter was odd. And like, at least he came to the wedding, so progress, I would say. But you see in these initial experiments with queer characters in video games in this era, a bit of modern criticism that you're gonna probably not find in games in the future. Then in the end of the decade, something amazing happened in Japan, and I remember this quite well. In the game Persona, I would say the character of Ju is quite revolutionary. Persona is, again, an RPG, and you're going to see this throughout the rest of this talk. The game genre that actually move things forward is the role-playing game. Is the ones that we have a bit more space to understand the characters before reducing them to a stereotype. And this character, June, is from the second game of the series, and he's openly gay, and he's accepted by his peers. Of course, his more female attributes are exaggerated, but he's not embarrassed by them. He embraces them. So much so that in one of the storylines, you can actually have a relationship between him and the main character, that his best friend. So it's the first time that you have a representation in a big game of a main character in commercial game that is very free of stereotypes and is a very likable character. The West tried to keep up and try to follow the trend, but they didn't really get the message. So all games that happen in few years after June in Persona will still show the stereotypical for laughs, female traces, villainous, nobody loves me kind of characters. They will try. But I think there was something that happened in the decade that was very interesting. It was the first time that you have the first gamer survey. And this is incredible. It was the first large-scale survey. There was more than 10,000 participants. Although it was not perfect. The methodology was a bit, I would say, dubious. It was led by the University of Illinois, and asked the players how they perceive themselves in the sexuality spectrum. For their surprise, 28%, only 28% said they were completely heterosexual. And then 23.7 said they are completely homosexual. The rest of the audience of gamers would be in this spectrum. And this is like eye-opening. By that time, gamers are straight teenagers in their rooms, and you have this huge expand of possibilities of sexuality of gamers around the world. At this point, you have to talk about this company called Bioware. And what Bioware did in the early 2000s to today. If you are a gamer, you probably don't have many good memories about Bioware recently. Their game, the last games are kind of lazy and not well executed. But in the very beginning of the run of games, they start creating these intricate RPGs with very likable queer characters that you can actually get to know and you can actually get into a romance with. A few caveats. Those characters are always a romantic interest, and they're always bisexual for some reason. Probably practically, because then you just have to code one character and it's okay for both sexes. But the way they advance those characters in terms of narrative, I think is commendable. Three of these characters that I absolutely love as Juhani, who is the first Star Wars bisexual character. And then I have Zephron, this kind of sweet talker elf that is quite okay with all kinds of love. And then Serendipity is the first transvestite of this universe. Probably all being criticized in some way, but I think they all help developing the narrative of a queer character as a complex character. This culminates in the Mass Effect trilogy, where the way you can find characters of the same sex and you can develop a relationship with them became actually a selling point of the game. So people was like, oh, who can I have a fling with right now? And although it was very focused on sexuality, they still have each one of the characters still have a lot of depth, so you can understand their backgrounds and kind of sympathize with them. Since then, every game, bigger game, needs some kind of queer participation, so they feel like they can tell everybody how open they are about these developing characters. And I'll say most of the times there are genuine attempts to understand queer characters and include them in narratives, sometimes less so. Borderlands 2 has these two characters called Maya and Zero, and they are described as asexual characters. For a game developer to try to understand a concept that sometimes is controversial, even in the queer community, is daunting. They don't actually expand too much about the how asexual they are. They just put this there and feels a bit like a token, but it still is a conversation starter. So I think it's positive. And bring us to my favorite decade of all decades I lived in is 2010s. And I love this decade because of the democratization of development tools for games. Before, you have the professional or people who dedicate their lives creating games. And after that, the tools become much easier to use. Internet proliferation means that you can get tutorials online, and then this explosion of indie games. Indie games, they don't need to follow a formula. They don't care about what people think about them. So you have a huge proliferation of games exploring all themes, including the queer theme. And the most important of this era, in my opinion, is Gone Home. This is a narrative game that's focused in these two sisters, in one of them, which is a lesbian character. And it goes very deep on the relationship of these two characters and how it evolves. The difference of this game and other games is that this was a huge success critically and in public. So it was a financial success that told the story of, you know, queer characters are actually very interesting and you should put more in your games. And the big companies actually listened. It took a while to listen. But it reverberates throughout the years to come. After that, the indie dev did quite a lot done, I would say. You can find queer games in a very, very broad spectrum, from Coming Out on Top, which is basically a grinder simulator, can go quite graphic sometimes, to something in the middle, a bit more nuanced, that's also called Coming Out, but not on top. There's a coming out, the story about this teenager boy trying to come out to his family, to the very serious game, This Is Where I Want to Die, which is a German game about gay characters dealing with homophobia and homophobic attacks. So the AAA games, the big games, start to catch up. And by the end of 2010s, you get games like The Last of Us, who has one teenager character who is a queer character. And then this is explored more in expansion of the game called Left Behind, where she remembers the time with her friend Ridley. I might have a problem with the audio, and of course the video is hard online. So I'm gonna show you guys a piece of the game, so a few minutes of the game. And if you cannot follow, I will send you the link and you can watch yourself later, just to show how the queer theme evolved with time. So what happens now, 2020? The words change, and it's time for us to ask deeper questions. The games that are going out right now, this is one of them, is called Tell Me Why. And it's the depth of the characters that they are trying to portray in those games is commendable. Tell Me Why tells the story of these two brothers, these siblings, and one of them grew up to be a transgender woman, Taylor. And then you come back to the childhood house to remember the time as children. I really want to play this game. I don't know if it's out yet, but this is the kind of question that you are asking now in terms of identity and finding oneself and then growing as a person. Thankfully, we don't have to wait another decade for the big games to catch up. If you remember the video that I showed, Ollie is now grow up, and the sequence of the game, The Last of Us, is now out now. It explores her as a young adult, as a queer character trying to survive in this world. And I think that this kind of story is one of the best-selling games in history. So it shows that it has appetite for stories that are not completely connected to one audience, but they're more diverse and they have questions that are different. So we come back to the question, who is the villain? And I hope we can frame this question a different way. And I hope the answer for this question is less obvious now. So we are in this unique moment in history where queer characters has the biggest visibility they ever had. Not ideal, I know, but it's better than any time of history. But the people who profit from keep us, you know, in the dark, feel like they can put us back in the dark. And I know there is, I try to not to go to sides, but we live in a world, but we are living in a cultural war. And what's the best place to show our stories is to tell queer stories as human stories. Is my work. That's what I'm trying to do. So people can see that we are human just like them, and we have fears, and we have love, and we have hopes just like them. And when they discover that our stories are valid and our points of view is valid, we're gonna find our space in spotlight. Thank you very much. don't know how to share.
Thanks a lot, Dan. That was an excellent talk. We're going to have a short break now, so we will just, if anyone needs to visit the bathroom or whatever, so we will be back just after 10 to 8 for some Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, probably just put the letter Q in the chat so that we know that, and then you can ask the question to Dan yourself.
Thank you.
I'm also going to stop the recording just there. So if you're watching the recording afterwards, thank you very much for joining, and thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much.